Today's program will address facilitation essentials for online meeting management. Our presenter today is Jeffrey Cufaude, an accomplished author, facilitator, speaker, and consultant for the past 20 plus years. Jeffrey Cufaude has helped individuals and organizations rethink their beliefs and behaviors in order to refresh their results. Previously, he has served as an association CEO and University Student Affairs staff member. You can find him online at www.ideaarchitects.org and on Twitter at JC46202. Welcome to the program, Jeffrey. The audience is all yours.
Thanks so much, Marcy, and greetings to everyone from downtown Indianapolis, which is where that 46202 zip code comes from. Let me frame your expectations for our fairly quick 30-minute session today. If you've ever been to a tapas or a small plate restaurant, you know that we get kind of appetizer-sized portions, and the idea is that we share those and end up having a pretty full meal at the end of it. Today's content is going to be like that. I'm going to be sharing some small plate pieces of content with you. Any one of those, you might actually want to have an entree-sized portion, but in our 30-minute session, we're going to keep it to a tapas-style setting. I'm going to give you two key questions that I think can inform your overall facilitation work, whether that be online or even in a face-to-face setting, 9 practical tips, and then we should have time for a little bit of Q&A. In the handout that is available for download, you find those 2 key questions for you to fill them in if you want to take notes as we go through, as well as the 9 practical tips overall. I'll be adding some additional information for each one of those tips, and SMPS will make the final slides available to you after the program. So let's begin with that first question. This is a useful question to ask before you schedule any meeting, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's an online setting. That question is pretty simple. Do the intended outcomes, the goals for your particular session, do they require people to convene together in a synchronous setting? Synchronous is just a fancy word meaning at the same time. So if we all gather together in a room, that's a synchronous setting. We're all gathered here online today, that's a synchronous setting. An asynchronous setting means that we're not all together at the same time. So if you ask yourself this question and the goals or the outcomes for your meeting do not require everyone to be together at the same time, you may not want to convene everyone in a synchronous setting. Particularly during these pandemic conditions, what a lot of organizations are doing is just every single meeting or conversation is moving online, and quite honestly, it's stressing out a whole lot of people. So we want to save the online synchronous conversations for when we truly all need to be together doing the same thing at the same time, and leverage the power of asynchronous settings, work offline, work on our own, that then can set us up for more powerful online conversations. And that's what some of my tips will be about today. The second key question relates to the actual definition of facilitation. So if you look at facilitation, at its root is the word facile, and facile means easy. So when we're facilitating, what we're trying to do is make it easier for people to engage the way we want them to produce the results of our conversation, and everything in between. I don't use athletic analogies because they don't always resonate with everyone, but I think this notion of facilitation is represented in spirit if we think about a spotter in weightlifting. So if an individual is going to try to lift heavier weights than she has done perhaps in the past, or maybe to crank out more reps than she typically does, in the case of this individual here in the picture, it's useful to get a spotter. The spotter's job is not to do the work for you, but to be there when you start to get fatigued and potentially you start to maybe lose the ability to complete a rep and could cause some harm to yourself. At minimum, as facilitators, we're trying to avoid doing any harm. We're essentially spotters for the group. We're trying not to do the work of the conversation, not being an active participant in it, but manage the conversation, be available, always alert, and see where individuals or the group may need some support in order for them to make it easier to complete the work that they've convened to do. So the question that you might want to ask if you're facilitating a meeting, or you may want to ask with your colleagues and brainstorm some responses collectively, is what might you need to make easier in an online meeting? And easier is going to be in the eyes of every individual. So something that is easy to me may be difficult for you. So one of the things we have to be careful when we're facilitating is to not impose our definition of what would be easy on everyone in the group. Facilitation is very much a servant leadership role. We have to think about the people that we're facilitating, the work that we've convened them to do online, and what would they find difficult, and how might we make it easier for them. Some of the most common things that online facilitation thinks about are listed here. At minimum, we've got to cover the basics of the audio-visual setting. Can people see? Can people hear? Are they familiar with the technology? Now is not the time to be introducing a new technology in an online meeting if you can avoid doing so. What would make it easier for you and your colleagues to have a thoughtful discussion? What type of advanced materials might they need? What types of questions are going to unearth the best contributions from every individual on your team? We want to make it easy to surface different perspectives. Sometimes there's that dead air or that silence when the conversation seems to be going a particular way. Maybe everyone doesn't agree. We want to be active facilitators to draw out those different perspectives so that there's still rigor and we make sound decisions, that we avoid bias or groupthink. Nothing is worse to me than when I facilitate an online or a face-to-face conversation, the group makes a decision and then they leave the conversation and go off and have side conversations about what really is going to happen. We can't afford to do that. We've got to make sure that there isn't groupthink going on and that we're surfacing different perspectives to make good decisions. And then finally, in an online setting, it's particularly challenging for us to manage attention and focus. So we want to think about the visuals that will support that, the audio cues, how you present yourself as the facilitator. We want to be thinking about smaller units of time for our meetings. Online meetings require a cognitive load that is far heavier than a face-to-face meeting. We just can't stay focused for as long as we can when we're together in person. So an hour online meeting really should be an exception rather than the rule. So those are kind of two overarching concepts or questions. Now let's drill down into some specific tactics and practical advice. The first draws from kind of the situation we find ourselves in right now with the pandemic. You want to think about flattening the curve of synchronous work online. So we now know flattening the curve in terms of our health pandemic means reducing the number of people who may need to go for a hospitalization so that we don't exceed the capacity of intensive care units and hospitals overall to serve everybody who needs health care. Same thing is true when we go online. We want to reduce the amount of work that we're doing at the same time together so we don't exceed individuals' capacity to manage those types of conversations. One of the ways we can do that, as I alluded to a little bit before, is to break up the synchronous work that we do together online with some asynchronous work that maybe is done offline or could be done online in different ways. So I'm part of a strategic planning group right now, and we're using an online post-it note platform that allows people to post comments. And we have a deadline of when we all need to post our comments. And when I go online, I see all the other post-its from my colleagues, just like if we were in a face-to-face session, and I'm able to move those post-its around, cluster them by themes, add additional notes to it. But we're doing all that on our own time offline. When we come online in sync, that's when we'll talk about all that other work that's been done. You might want to think about multiple smaller curves that have some asynchronous work and some synchronous work that collectively total that total amount of work that needs to be done. So today we're doing a 30-minute session. You could think about what if we had 3 30-minute sessions that would represent kind of a 90-minute breakout session at a regular conference. Breaking that work into smaller chunks, flattening the curve with both what's done online and leveraging the power of offline. Whether the work is online or offline, we may want to think about priming it. If you've painted walls, you know that unless you're painting the exact same color or you're painting a darker color over a lighter color, you pretty much want to put down a coat of primer to make it easier for the actual paint to take hold. The same thing is true for our online work. We want to think about what type of a primer coat do we need to provide to make it easier for that work to occur. I think about priming 3 things when I'm facilitating face-to-face or online meetings. The first is priming the relationships. Ask yourself, what priming will help you connect with each other as needed right now? If you're working with an intact team online where everybody already knows each other, we don't need you to do a lot of icebreakers, no getting acquainted exercises, but you might still want to touch base at an interpersonal level just to get a sense of how everybody's feeling in these challenging times, something that connects us together as people before we start working together as professionals. The second is priming the conversation. Depending on the goal or the intended outcome for your online meeting, you may need to prime that conversation differently. A creative conversation that's just going to be about brainstorming ideas might require different priming than a strategy conversation or a budget review where you're going to be looking at how can you change some of the financial allocations to weather current conditions. And then finally, thinking about what you do online and how you can use that to prime and accelerate what occurs offline, making sure that we are preparing ourselves to go offline and get in action right away. One of the things that can prime the work online is using a more detailed agenda. I recommend that for each specific agenda item, you want to list the intended outcome. So you have the agenda item, the intended outcome. Is it to make a decision? Is it to generate ideas? Let people know what the end result is for that particular item. How much time and maybe the format that you're going to use for it. That'll let people kind of track where we're at in the meeting agenda and our progress. Third and fourth kind of go together. Are there any key points, bullet points, or any questions for each agenda item that can help people start thinking in advance asynchronously to be more prepared to contribute to the synchronous conversation? And then finally, if there are background documents, a budget document, a proposal, anything that would help people prepare for the online conversation, you can provide hyperlinks to make that available for them to read in advance. The agenda is one of the most underutilized tools in face-to-face or online facilitation. We can do a lot better in making that a way to prime the work that we do online. When we bring people online, it's important to clarify the rules of engagement. If you and your team meet online regularly, you probably already have norms and an online meeting culture that works for you. But if you're convening a group of people that haven't interacted online together either previously at all or very much, it's useful to kind of clarify, how are we going to do this online dance? How are our conversations going to unfold? A couple of the real basics that I encourage you to think about is having an agreement around video. Are we all going to do video, or is nobody going to do video other than who's speaking or the presenter at a particular time? Some platforms, you can set them so that only the people speaking, their video takes over the screen. So you can use the technology tools in some cases to facilitate that agreement. How are you handling audio? Today, all of you are muted. In some online meetings, people can unmute themselves. In others, people have to raise their hand and have a facilitator like me unmute them. Do you want people to announce themselves each time they speak? Even with a group that knows each other well, sometimes the audio doesn't sound like the person the same way it does face-to-face, and it can be helpful to have that clarification. How are we going to handle disagreements and decisions? Those both require more active facilitation than what you might be thinking. You can't assume that silence implies a level of commitment to the decision. If there are significant disagreements, are you going to table that topic? Are you going to maybe poll the group and have them vote on which perspective they're most in support of? It's useful for people to know that up front. Side conversations. Making an agreement to not use instant messaging, Slack channels, other ways that people could be having a side conversation that isn't being heard by the entire group. And then finally, if you are doing a longer meeting, it's useful to know where there are going to be breaks and how those are going to be managed. One agreement that I think it's useful to make is for you to involve others in the facilitation. The longer the meeting, the more agenda items you have, the more useful I think this can be, just so people hear different voices and so that different people have the experience and learn how to better facilitate a group conversation. Here are some of the ways that you could involve others in the facilitation. For each specific agenda item, you could have a different facilitator so that it's a rotating responsibility that everybody gets to perform at some point over the course of multiple online meetings. More introverted listeners are often very good summarizers. These are the people who maybe we think aren't participating because we're not hearing them verbally, but they're actually participating in a reflective internal listening capacity. And they're great people to ask to summarize what they've heard from the conversation. Scribes can play an important function. If you think in a face-to-face meeting, you might have someone flip charting while someone else is facilitating. It could be useful in an online meeting to have somebody who is taking notes on an online whiteboard or some other technology resource to capture visually the key decisions that are being made and some of the information that can relay back to visual learners what's happening and where we're at. It's helpful sometimes to have somebody who's specifically focused on monitoring participation. Who's speaking a lot? Who haven't we heard from? What perspectives haven't been represented? And finally, you could just involve some people in terms of overall quality control. What could be done better to accelerate what we're trying to achieve in the online conversation? We often think of a designated facilitator. That's useful, but we can still have other people performing individual functions that help us achieve the outcomes of the online session. One of the things that we need to do, whether we assign it to someone or whether we're doing that as a facilitator, is to monitor and enable individual contributions. A couple of tips that I found helpful to do this when I'm facilitating online. Up to about 20 or 25 people, I find it useful to have a list of all the attendees, and when one of them speaks, I just place a check mark next to their name. Not everyone participates verbally, but what that allows me to do is with a very quick glance, I can see who's contributing a lot, who we haven't heard from, and how I might need to act in order to balance the participation out and draw on more perspectives so we have more thoughtful discussions. One of the easiest ways to draw on more perspectives is to extend that invitation for people to contribute verbally. And there's different ranges of specificity with which you can do that. So my catchphrase is, I'd love to hear from, but how I finish that sentence varies. I could say, I'd love to hear from someone that we haven't heard from yet today. That's an open-ended invitation that anybody can RSVP to. I could get functionally specific. I'd love to hear from the finance team on this. I'd love to hear from the marketing group. I'd love to hear from somebody who has worked with this client before. We're starting to get more and more specific, and you can always go to an individual. I'd love to hear from Marcy right now. My bias is to always allow people to pass when the invitation is extended to them, because we don't want to put people on the spot online any more than we might want to face-to-face. Another way that you can invite participation is to go around the room, metaphorically. And going around the room means everybody is going to get a chance to speak. When it gets to their turn, if they have nothing new to add, they can just say pass, nothing new. Or if they just want to echo a specific opinion that someone's already expressed, they can just say ditto what Jeffrey said. This is kind of like a roll call vote in Congress. There are certain times in a meeting where you might want to have the invitation for everybody to get a chance to speak and to do that in a very orderly fashion. If your technology platform allows, you could break people out into smaller group conversations. Each group could be in its own breakout room talking about the same question, or you could have each group in a different breakout room with a different question. They come back together and report out just like we would in a face-to-face meeting. And finally, using the polling function, both to assess potential support for a decision that's being considered, what people think may be the right opinion to pursue further in discussion. You can use the poll in lots of different ways to effectively get individuals contributing. I find that you want to give a percentage for polling. So today we've got about 100 people on the webinar. If we were doing a poll, I would say let's try to get at least 75 to 80 of us, a critical mass. The smaller the group, the more you want to hear from everybody in the actual poll. Hey, we're in the home stretch on tips, the final third. Carefully crafting your questions. We want to use questions that make it easier for people to contribute their best thinking. This is particularly true when the conversation is going to be creative or around looking for an innovative idea or solution. We probably all are familiar with open versus closed questions. We want to avoid closed questions, particularly where we assume what people's responses might mean. So if I would say, are we all in agreement with this? That's a closed question with a built-in yes or no response. If you've ever been on an online meeting, sometimes a couple of people respond and then there's a whole lot of silence. That silence doesn't imply consent or agreement, so that's not really a good way to ask about agreement from a group. A more open-ended way would be, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with the decision that we're contemplating? 1 being not at all, 5 being I'm totally on board. You could have everybody, if they're on video camera, just hold up their fingers. You could create a polling function slide and do a poll that way so it's anonymous responses, but that's a better way to assess agreement. Avoid framing bias. Be careful in the language you use with your questions that it doesn't drive the conversation into a predetermined place or outcome. So the first draft of my question sometimes has a little bit of a bias built into it that I didn't realize, and then I need to go back and I need to edit to clean that up a little bit. And then finally, think about broad versus specific. A very specific question, again, is going to move people into a limited range of their own contribution or creativity, but a question that is too broad is going to be difficult for people to connect with. They're not going to know where they can go in the conversation. And so we want to have something that kind of straddles that fence of not being so broad that it could go anywhere, but not being so specific that it can really only go into one place. In terms of maintaining an attention and focus during an online meeting, it can be useful if you choose to summarize conversations. Here's where we're at, here's what's coming up next, and providing those status updates more often. Think of the online meeting as a long road trip. You want to build in rest stops and breaks to recapture people's attention and focus and to let them know where we're at, because it's potentially likely that people have become distracted during the conversation, either based on their setting or just their mind wandering because you've been online for some time. Again, don't forget using visual cues here, having a scribe who can kind of keep track of the record of key points from the conversation. People who are visual learners, that becomes a really positive reinforcement that helps them stay engaged, even if you're not providing a lot of verbal status updates. And last but not least, we don't want to leave people hanging at the end of a meeting. One of the facilitation malpractice things that comes up far more often than I would care to admit is we have a really good agenda and we get to the end and we just have to finish. There's no time to really bring appropriate closure. You want to think back to that original flattening the curve and that there was a good chunk of time left for what happens after the official conversation part of the meeting ends. You want to design that into the agendas that you build because that's what's going to accelerate post-meeting action. A couple of things that I find useful: to review the key actions, the decisions that we've made collectively, and then to let individuals share what commitments, what follow through, what actions are they taking. By going around and having each person say, well, here's what my follow-up is, that reinforces in that own individual's mind the work that they're doing, but it also lets the group have some sense of peer-to-peer accountability, or who doesn't have any follow-up action and how we might want to engage them in doing some work offline. Secondly, if it's appropriate for your group, you might think about doing just a little bit of a reconnection interpersonally. We talked about priming relationships on the front end. It's nice sometimes to just bring some closure again and connect again as people with some sort of a very quick, could be just one simple question that everyone goes around and answers. Just reinforces relationships and the team spirit that we hope to maintain over time. Gather some quick feedback. I'm a big believer in surveying right at the end of an online meeting. 2 simple questions. 1, what worked for you in this meeting today? 2, what's one thing that you'd like to see happen in the next meeting that would make it even more effective, and why? We want to constantly be getting better at this, continuous improvement in how we engage with each other online. Gathering feedback is the only way to do that. And then finally, provide some minutes and minutes. We think of minutes as being kind of the historical record of those actions taken and the individual commitments that people have made. Sending that back out in writing, having a visual record of that is a nice way to reinforce the verbalization of that occurred at the end of the meeting. So 9 tips in addition to those big questions, and I think we've got time for a couple of your questions in terms of what may be on your mind at this point. And so I'll let Marcy select where we may want to start the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Jeffrey, for those 9 tips. At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, please remember just submit it in the question box. You can type your question directly there and just hit submit. So our first question, are there any ideal lengths for online meetings?
Yeah, so I think ideal is always going to be in relation to the capacity of your group. What have you learned about your group in terms of their ability to do work online? And then what length does the nature of the work require? Some conversations are just going to take a certain period of time and you can't really break that into multiple chunks. In general, I try to have our online conversations be no more than an hour. Even if it's doing an hour, taking a 15-minute offline break and then coming back for another 30 to 60 minutes, you want to think about kind of what's the workflow in a typical day, and people are moving and they're changing places, and try to mirror that as much as you can in the online setting.
Great, thank you. Another question, would you be able to share the online Post-it tool that you mentioned?
You know, that's so funny. Right as I said that coming out of my mouth, I was like, somebody's going to ask about this. I don't have it readily available, but I will make that available to Marcy, and we'll get that information out to all of you somehow. So I don't have it at the top of mind. I apologize for that.
Oh, no problem. Yes, we can share afterwards. So another question, what do you need to pay extra attention to if people convening online have not worked together much before, online or in person?
Yeah, I think if people haven't worked together much before, we really need to spend some of that time priming. You know, particularly if you're going to be making significant decisions, because we need to know where people are coming from and trust them. I don't think you have to do that priming all online. I mean, one of the things that I might do with a group that's not worked together before is have 3 to 5 questions about them in advance, gathering information that would be useful for everyone in the group to know about them, and then to produce that as kind of a participant directory that I would distribute to everyone prior to the meeting so that we can learn a little bit more about each other. It could be, you know, how do you normally participate? Are you a big picture person or a detail-oriented person? What specific perspectives or experience do you bring to this type of a conversation? What's a pet peeve that you have about group decision making? Some things that let us know about the interpersonal dynamics that we would otherwise learn in real time going through the conversation, to try to gather some of that up front to make it easier for us to actually engage.
Great. So a final question, Jeffrey. What can a facilitator do if people aren't really participating as desired or needed during an online meeting?
Excellent question. So there's kind of an in the moment, what can I do right now? But then you also would want to follow up afterwards, either in the feedback that you gather or to look at how could I have used the agenda differently to create participation? What wasn't done in the pre-work that would have made it easier for people to engage online? Sometimes there's nothing bad about a lack of online engagement. It could be that people are just in agreement with the few people that are speaking. But I would probably call attention to the fact that you notice that only a few people are speaking. You're not sure what that means, and do an around the room. Give everybody a chance to let you know and let the group know why they're participating the way that they are. It'll allow you to potentially surface anything that you may want to do as a facilitator. I know we covered a lot of ground today, and before I turn it back to Marcy to close, I just wanted to highlight a couple of additional resources that you may find valuable. The Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision-Making is twice as big as the other 2 books, literally on screen, but also in size when you buy the book. It's my #1 recommendation. It is an incredibly useful tool for online and offline meetings. I give it as a gift consistently. I think you'll really, really value it. 2 other books that each had a couple of ideas that I found useful, but overall I thought were a little bit weaker, would be Mission Critical Meetings and The Surprising Science of Meetings. They might still be worth taking a look at if you find the Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making doesn't cover everything that you wanted. So I'm going to thank you in advance, and we'll certainly follow up with the resources that you inquired about. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Marcy to close.
Thank you, Jeffrey. On behalf of SMPS, we thank you as our presenter for today, and to all of our participants. The program has ended. You may now disconnect.